Charged with protecting civilians from indiscriminate slaughter, the UN takes responsibility for keeping the peace in Central African Republic. But with sectarian and religious violence running rife, is there any peace to keep? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. It's a country that's been scarred by coups, wars and instability. But a conflict pitting Muslims and Christians against each other in Central African Republic is reaching new and shocking levels of violence, characterized by the widespread rape and killing of civilians, the burning and looting of homes, and a seemingly endless cycle of reprisal attacks. The United Nations is now faced with the daunting challenge of breaking that cycle, as it takes over responsibility for restoring and keeping the peace. A mainly Muslim and Seleka rebel seized power in March last year, but failed to prevent some fighters from going on the rampage. That led to a counter-offensive by Christian militias, with both sides deliberately targeting each other's civilian communities. New figures estimate that more than 5,000 people have been killed since December, although it's feared that figure could be a lot higher. Around 1 in 4 of the population, that's almost 1 million people, have been forced from their homes. Many have fled to neighbouring countries, but more than 500,000 remain displaced within Central African Republic, and 60% of those are children. And these are the people trying to restore stability. The African Union has had 6,500 soldiers in Central African Republic since last July. On Monday, they were joined by 1,500 UN peacekeepers. The UN mission will now assume overall control and expects to have some 12,000 peacekeepers in the country by the end of next year. France deployed 2,000 soldiers in December. For now, they will continue to work alongside the UN mission. Now, since 1977, there have been 13 regional and international peacekeeping operations in Central African Republic. So can this latest mission make any difference? Let's get the thoughts of our guests for this Inside Story. In Nairobi, we have Lewis Mudge, a researcher for Human Rights Watch Africa Division. From London, we have James Schneider, editor of Think Africa Press. And joining us from Paris is Emmanuel Dupuy, president of the Institute for Prospective and Security in Europe. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. James Schneider, if I could start with you. Will any of this make a difference then?
I think it will make a difference. It's very important that it is happening, even if it's not quite as much as the country needs. I mean, one of the key elements of this, the rehatting of the forces over to a UN force from an African force, is the policing capacity that it's going to bring, and that's really crucial if there's going to be any sort of stop to impunity that's all over the country. But that's not to say that just because there are some peacekeeping forces which were requested a really long time ago and have taken some time to be mobilised means that all of the problems within the country are going away. As you said in your introduction, I mean, the CAR has had a really long and ongoing cycle of different types of conflicts within its borders and then international actors being involved. So I think we should be applauding the step and hopeful of what could happen, but very aware of the many problems that the Central African Republic is facing.
Emmanuel Dupuy, obviously, I mean, I suppose you welcome this announcement that the UN is sending more forces. But what is France's position in all of this? We mentioned there that they have 2,000 troops there. How are they going to be coordinated with what the UN is doing, and how long are they going to stay there?
Well, normally, as the resolution 2149 mentions it, France will be at the center of this operation, since you already mentioned 2,000 of our troops are on the ground and they will stay on the ground. They will be fully integrated with the MINUSCA, which is not announced, which is starting today because the transfer of command is happening today in Bangui. And as the United Nations resolution mentions it, France will apply to provide by any means the security which is needed for the fulfillment of the United Nations missions. It's not only about reassuring security, it's also about allowing the political transition, as it has been mentioned throughout the 4 previous United Nations mandates, resolution what is important for the Central African Republic is to reassure security, to provide justice and reconciliation, and that's another part of its mission. But the last of its mission.
Sure. When you say by any means, what do you mean by that?
Well, precisely, it's mentioned in the resolution that France may be called upon if there is a need for harsh security, and it's quotes, the mission will have open fire recommendation under Chapter 7, a more fluid command. That is to say that France will be, excuse me, this French appellation, Nation Cadre, which can also be considered as the most harshest and be at the center of the operation. It will provide a more, let's say, kinetical capabilities.
Lewis Mudge, this has been in many ways kind of a forgotten conflict, if you will. The headlines around the world for much of the last few weeks and months even have been dominated by events in Iraq and Syria with ISIL, and much of the world has, many people would say, rightly condemned what's happening. But when you look at what's been happening in Central African Republic just over the last year, I mean, it has made for some horrific reading, just in reading some of the accounts of this, of the atrocities on civilians. I mean, some of them I can't even get into on the air, really. It's been so graphic. Why do you think that is? Why has the world seemingly forgotten about Central African Republic?
Well, you're talking about a country that in many parts of the world, they don't even know this place exists, especially outside of France. Many people in Europe and in the United States can't find Central African Republic on a map. It's been a very neglected country. On all of the UNDP indicators on poverty, education, and health, it comes in at the bottom. And over the last year and a half plus, as we've been monitoring the situation in CAR, we've noticed that a real fatigue has set in on behalf of the international community. People are tired once again of the seemingly intractable conflict in this country.
But in terms of natural resources in the country, obviously in the Middle East there's a lot of oil, so the cynics would argue that's why many of the big powers are taking an interest in what is happening there. What's the situation as far as Central African Republic?
There is actually oil in the northeast of the Central African Republic, but more importantly, there's timber, there's gold, there's diamonds, and there's uranium to be found in CAR. Natural resources are certainly a driver of conflict on a local level in the Central African Republic. But to get to your question, this is a country that has been in conflict since independence. A lot of the global powers, with the exception of France, have decided to move away from this country and not be too involved. And so you find that this is a country where many of the embassies outside of it don't really have a real knowledge as to what's going on. There's a real lack of knowledge as to the major players on the ground. This is a forgotten about country, and the crisis, unfortunately, has fallen again from the headlines.
James Schneider, why do you think this has been ignored so much by the media lately?
Because there's been so much going on, and I agree with pretty much everything that Lewis just said. But the CAR is a relatively small country which is very, very poorly linked up to the rest of the continent, let alone the rest of the world, in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of communication, the internet. So it's difficult for a kind of constituency of people who are interested in and care about the Central African Republic to build up. And if you compare it to the crisis taking place next door in South Sudan, which is also undercovered and underfunded, but not as much as in the Central African Republic, South Sudan has a large constituency in much of the sort of international community, large UNDP presence, large NGO presence, so it gets covered. There are people who are pushing the story. In the Central African Republic, especially because the story is predominantly Francophone, not Anglophone, there are just far fewer people trying to get the story on the air.
Emmanuel Dupuy, I mean, when we look at the peacekeeping efforts in the country at the moment, such as they are, the existing force of African Union troops don't seem to have been able to stem the violence there. The 2,000 or so French troops that we talked about as well. Why would another 1,500 UN troops make any difference?
Well, the problematic is not how much it takes, but how long it takes. And I think it's an important issue which was raised by the two previous speakers to say that there's been an ongoing effort to stabilize this country since the independence. As it was mentioned, France has been there for a long, long time. With the Sangaris operation, we are complying our 12th mission, 12th military presence in the country. And to continue on what has been said, I don't see international discrepancy or disinterest on Central African Republic based on the fact that all of the neighboring countries have been applying to find an issue difficultly on the Central African agenda. Of course, big actors such as the neighbors want to have in mind Chad and Congo. So there's been an ongoing effort, and the problem is not new. It's an ongoing problem between on governance or bad governance as it was usually set up. The issue is about the linkage between what has been said previously, the fact that northern eastern part of the country is broadly composed of Muslims and the southern part is basically still Christian, and there's been a sort of ongoing agenda based on both political and both ethnical and as well as religious opposition on the area. But to respond directly to your question, the issue is about going to the elections, which normally should have been taken place in February of next year. I'm not sure they will take place. It's about also providing security and justice. One of the parts of the United Nations mandate mentions the fact that 4 of the actors of the Central African crisis must go to court and must be tried upon the IPC, and this is exactly what was mentioned in the mandate. And of course, you also have to rebuild this country, both on a security level. We're speaking about the reform of the security sector, and we're also speaking about the common DDR process, demobilization, demilitarization, and reintegration. So United Nations operation is not only about providing security, assuming the logistical dimension, which is to bring the humanitarian aid not only in Bangui but in all of the country, but also to provide the stability which is needed to go to the electoral process.
James Schneider, much of what has been promised by the UN as well hasn't been delivered. There was talk of thousands of troops from the UN being there by April. We're now September. We have 1,500 troops added. Now it's still a long way off from what was originally promised. Why is that?
Well, it's difficult to get. The UN is not doesn't have a standing army to build up peacekeeping troops. You have to get input from all the different countries that are willing to be involved, and sadly, at the moment, there just were too few, given the other crises that were going on in the world and the relative importance that was placed on the Central African Republic. I mean, it is really sad that the Prime Minister it was in May of last year. Called for the peacekeepers. That was already after Michel Djokovic had become president, Seleko had overthrown Bouazizi, and the man who was the transitional prime minister was kept on in his role, and he was calling for UN peacekeepers then. I think what it should do is really focus our minds towards how would the regional security architecture and global security architecture be set up so that whenever the next crisis happens, response can be much, much faster.
Lewis, Mudge, I know we've touched on some of this already, but a crisis like this doesn't just simply erupt over a few months. It's something that's been going on for years. What do you think are some of the root causes of what's happening in Central African Republic?
Sure. Well, I think that the most predominant root cause would be the mismanagement of the Bouazizi regime. The man who was president before the Seleka overthrew him in March of 2013. He was running a government based on nepotism and corruption, and he particularly marginalized the northeast of the country over his 10-year reign, thereby creating this animosity of the predominantly Muslims in that region to get together, form this Seleka alliance, and topple him. Unfortunately, The Seleka were no better at ruling than Bouazizi, and in many regards they were much worse. And so what we're seeing now with these anti-Balaka militias that are still roaming around the east, and with Seleka that are still burning down villages and attacking villagers as we speak, we're seeing a direct result of Bouazizi just completely grinding this country into the ground.
James Schneider, you see it that way as well? I mean, what would you highlight as some of the long-term causes of what's happening there now?
I think what Lewis has said is correct, but I would probably broaden that out to take in much more of the entire post-colonial experience, the dominance by France, France's willingness to prop up and support incredibly nepotistic, kleptocratic, dictatorial rule. And there are these cleavages within the country, but I think it's important to state that the religious element is relatively new, and that is the kind of overarching thing has become the problem since this particular wave of violence started. And whilst it was present to some extent in the past, it was not the main driving factor for a crisis in the Central African Republic, which, as everyone's been saying, was very long-standing. And to the extent at which, before this particular bit of the crisis happened, so that now back in 2011, there was a Médecins Sans Frontières report which showed how large swathes of the country were already in emergency status for the mortality rate. So this is a really long-standing crisis. We should be looking at its roots going all the way back, because it's the way in which it's going to be solved is with solving some of these underlying issues. And Bouazizi, I think, exacerbated them and made them worse rather than starting them from scratch.
Just continuing that theme of many of these problems going all the way back, Emmanuel Dupuy, if we take that further, France is this is a former colony for France. I mean, how much responsibility does France bear for some of these problems?
Well, it's a usual question. We have to have in mind that Central African Republic was really the outskirts and the last limit of our empire before the Belgium dominion, which is now the Congo, both Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo. The responsibility of France is always to have tried to develop a country which does not have a linkage to the sea. That's one of the issue, of course. And of course, you have to have in mind that it's a big country, but gathering both France as the size of France and Belgium. It is a country in which, as it has been mentioned, all of the regimes amongst the 6 presidents, 4 come from the military and have gained power using military dominion and military force. So there is a problem of democracy building in this country, and this is why it's an ongoing problem. As we are speaking today, there are more than 70 political parties in Bangui. We're not sure there will be a clear consensus of who will run for the presidency. There is a problem of inaccuracy to divide the power, to share the power, and of course, as it has been mentioned, there is a problem between center and periphery. The northern and most of all the northeast part has not been sufficiently taken in consideration, and that leads to another problem, which is the proxy actors and the role that the neighbors have been playing, disturbing the stability of the country, whether it may be Chad with the Muslim-linked population or Cameroon and Congo on the western side of the country.
Lewis Mudge, what do you think it's ultimately going to take to see more of a political will here to tackle the problems in Central African Republic, not just from people inside the country, but from outside, from the international community?
I think it's going to take seeing concrete steps moving in the right direction, and frankly, I think it's way too early to start talking about political processes. I came back from the country yesterday on my 8th trip since the coup, and I can tell you that the absolute priority of MINUSCA, which will be the UN mission taking over, has to be civilian protection. People are still dying in large numbers outside of the capital. They're being killed by both Seleka and anti-Balaka. And as your guest earlier pointed out, it's not just breaking down on religious lines. We are seeing anti-Balaka, which are known as Christian militias, targeting other Christians. So it's certainly becoming very chaotic outside the capital. I think we have to stop the killing. I think humanitarian actors need to be allowed into some of these very dangerous zones, particularly in the center east, near where the Seleka are holding territory. And I think we have to start allowing them to save lives. After that, whether that's in 1 year, 18 months, or 2 years down the line, then we can start having conversations about voting and political processes. But for the instant, right now, the priority has to be to save lives, and hopefully international political actors will realize that their investment in this UN mission is paying off.
James Schneider, just picking up on that, I mean, it was mentioned earlier, this is a very big country we're talking about. Are just a few thousand peacekeeping troops really going to be enough to tackle the job? I mean, if what Lewis is saying, that it's going to need protecting those villages, it's presumably going to need a very large number of boots on the ground to do that.
I'd like to completely endorse everything that Lewis has just said. I think that's exactly the right priority should be protecting lives, and the walk towards elections can slow down, frankly. We could do with more troops. That would be helpful, but I don't think we should say that just because they're only going to be 12,000 plus the 2,000 French that nothing can be done. I mean, large amounts of civilians can be protected, and also humanitarian corridors created to get aid in, allow crops to be planted, and some semblance of normality to return to large swathes of the country can happen with these numbers of troops.
Just final word to you then, Emmanuel Dupuy, just in a couple of minutes that we've got left here. Are you ultimately optimistic about tackling the very deep-seated problems in Central African Republic?
Well, as it was mentioned, 12,000 troops are definitely not sufficient to provide that mission. As I already said, it's a big country.
How many
we have done
do you think there
analysis
should
here
be
in Paris with a certain number of my colleagues. We reckon the fact that if we compare to Afghanistan, we have 1 soldier for 200 soldiers which were present in Afghanistan for a country specifically the same size. So I would reckon we should have had at least twice the number of peacekeepers. But the problem is also the financing of the operation. We are speaking about an operation which may cost $800 million for till April 2015, which is the first date in which there will be a summary, a discussion about the pursuing of this mission. So I think we have to compare here with Mali. We have specifically the same numbers of peacekeepers which were promised by the international community, but in Mali only half of these soldiers finally came, and only half of the financing were there. So the question is not only having all of the soldiers which are reportedly coming by the end of the year, but to have the financing, and I think we should have at least twice as more. Again, what has been said, it's not only about securing Bangui and its airport, where you have a lot of refugees who are still there, but it's also to stabilize the routes going out from Bangui, both towards Cameroon and again entering into a zone where now no one is really entering, at least the Central African, what is left or what is still existing in the Central African Army, which is in the northern part of the country, northern eastern part of the country, where the Seleka are gathering and in a certain way rebuilding a state which is own army and its own system of governance.
That is going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all three of our guests, Lewis Mudge in Nairobi, James Schneider in London, and Emmanuel Dupuy in Paris. Thanks very much. And thank you for watching. Please feel free to add your thoughts to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for us on @AJ Inside Story. I'm Hazem Sika. For me and all the team, goodbye for now.